With the corn and the potatoes going into the ground for the spring, the group felt hope rising once more. They'd survived their first winter. And while there was certainly cause for celebration, it was important, now that they knew how harsh and long the winters here were, that they spend the growing season preparing carefully, stockpiling as much food as possible to ensure they can see themselves through the next winter. That morning saw the peninsula bear witness to a peculiar aerial event, as a large meteor of iron plummeted from the night sky onto the land, dislodging a large iron golem that seemed to be attached to it. Thankfully, the fall seemed to have rendered the golem dormant, and as there was no need for iron at the moment, and no desire for their limbs to be ripped off, they chose to leave the golem and its meteor in peace, for the time being. Although the crops for this season were just about to go into the ground, the group understood that being able to continue growing crops during the winter would be an ideal solution to their food concerns. To this end, Prentice, Oiwun and Jayla, utilising their respective plant knowledge, construction knowledge and book smarts, got together and began drawing up plans to utilise one of the steam geysers on the peninsula as a heat source, to allow them to grow crops throughout the year. In the interest of moving more of their buildings away from being made of wood, Oiwun suggested using some of the clay they'd managed to shape into bricks to build the structure, which would be a large dome encompassing the vent to the north of the peninsula. The ground around the vent was mostly sand, and thus unsuitable for growing anything, so Jayla worked to create some artificial growing beds, and conferred with Oiwun about how they could fit it all in the area. As Oiwun began work, Jayla suggested a staggered entryway, to help keep the heat in during the blisteringly cold winter nights. Although the others were busy planting the crops, Oiwun was free to spend all of her time constructing the dome, and, in her usual fashion, was progressing the work at the speed of lightning. That evening, Blackthorn declared to the group that there was enough anima grass for them to perform another linking ritual, awakening someone else in the group to their innate magic. After the success of Blackthorn's linking, Guthor decided that he should be next in line. Once again, the ritual went smoothly. It seems that Guthor's desire to protect his people from harm had manifested in his newfound magic, and he gained the ability to use his magic to speed up the recovery rate of anyone who got injured. After Oiwun had thrown all the walls of the dome together, her apprentice, Magnala, threw on the roof, leaving a single gap in the centre of the dome to act as a chimney. The heat from the geyser would likely be way too much in an entirely enclosed space, so leaving a small chimney in the roof allowed for the room to maintain a good temperature without becoming so hot that the whole thing became a raging inferno. With the group seemingly distracted building the dome, their prisoner took the opportunity to try and escape from captivity. Unfortunately for them, they timed their attempt very poorly, and found themselves escaping right into the path of Oiwun and her massive club. Seeing the commotion, Jayla also ran over to try and help. Her first arrow took a non-lethal pass right through the prisoner's lung, but unfortunately her second arrow took a slightly more lethal path, straight through the prisoner's brain. Despite their joy at the planet life returning to the peninsula, it sadly hadn't returned soon enough for their poor yak, who soon succumbed to starvation. More unfortunately, it had been the female yak, which meant no more milk. With no ability to produce more yak, and no ability to produce milk, they decided to slaughter the male yak too, saving them the food it required and also providing them with some meat until their first harvest could come in. That afternoon, Oiwun finished up the first batch of growing beds in the dome. Consulting Prentice, they knew that their only real option for what to grow in the dome would be mushrooms. Anything else would require some form of light. The roof, however, would block the sunlight, but without a roof, they wouldn't be able to keep the room at a decent temperature. It was quite unfortunate, as the only mushrooms they could grow were really quite disgusting and slimy, which wouldn't help with the already terrible moods around the town, if they needed to rely on those for food. But at the very least it'd mean that they had some way to grow sustenance throughout the winter months. On the upside, the theory behind the growing dome seemed to be effective, so Oiwun endeavoured to fill as much of it as reasonable with growing beds for more mushrooms. With the town becoming larger, it was becoming increasingly time consuming to travel from one side to the other, including making it difficult for the collective to reach their defences before any attackers. To remedy this, Guthor was determined to have the group plan out proper routes around the town, so continued working with the builders to put down roads, and even bridges where appropriate. Speaking of the defences, Magnala had suggested that it would be sensible to build a field hospital near to them. She was experienced in combat, and knew that even the best defences couldn't protect everyone from harm, so having a hospital nearby where they could be easily dragged to have their wounds tended would help keep everyone alive. With a lot of the construction work edging further south on the peninsula, Elven suggested moving some of their storage down that way, to save them time hauling materials all the way from the centre of town to the outer walls. Magnala had taken over some of the cooking duties since her arrival, and had been complaining about cooking their meals in the already cramped and quite dirty main shelter. Guthor decided that they could tackle both of these issues at once, asking Magnala and Elven to construct a new woodworking shed next to the animal pen, and suggesting that Magnala move the stove and their food storage into the old woodworking shed. Although it may not be as strong as other stone chunks, and would require extra processing to be useful, the group did have an abundance of clay in the beds of the ponds around the peninsula. Elven, eager to stop constructing buildings out of wood, suggested that if anyone should ever happen to find themselves with some spare time on their hands, they should go to the ponds and begin collecting up as much clay as they could. That evening, the group finally all gathered up for Louisa and Prentice's marriage ceremony. Despite the rain, spirits were high as the group took a break to celebrate the love of the couple, as well as the great progress that they'd made so far in building a new and better world for themselves and the couple's imminent new arrival. Later that night, as the usual group prayed at the anima tree, Blackthorn insisted that she felt as though her magic was growing stronger. To test her new power, she tried to channel it into causing increased growth in the area nearby. This ended up working to great success, causing a massive bloom of bog beacon to suddenly explode out of the nearby earth, its luminous glow casting an eerie light across the night. The next day, optimistic about how much they could grow, especially given Blackthorn's new powers, the group hollowed out more of the hillside to allow them to store even more food. They hoped to have this room packed to the rafters with dried meat and crops before the snow started to fall once more. With everything going so smoothly for a change, the group had even found time to carve a decent supply of limestone bricks. Eager to progress the town technologically, Guthor met with Elven and Magnala to plan out a smithy for them using the bricks. Once they were able to work with the iron ore they'd collected, they could create significant improvements to everyone's weaponry and armour, helping to improve their chances of survival. The next day saw the first harvest of radishes for the season, finally taking the pressure off of the group's bellies. Although the presence of a number of wild boar on the peninsula meant the group wouldn't be choking down just radishes alone. Another improvement that the group were very keen to make before the next winter rolled around was to give each home a small wood burning stove, just to provide them with a little bit of heat during the cold months. With the snow thawing, it also made it easier for outside forces to travel to the peninsula, and this time the Divine Order had taken it upon themselves to try and destroy Ysera's Perch. The Divine Order were the worst of the worst when it came to the humans, a religious organisation which influenced the actions of the whole human population. They're led by a belief that this world was made for humans, and that the old world races are simply a blight to be eradicated. Their power and influence meant that their forces were often well equipped, which could pose an issue for the Collective. The Collective made for the defences, but once again were unable to reach them in time, and instead took up a position around the shell of the new smithy. The traps at the entrance managed to subtract one from the Divine Order's numbers, but a few of them opted to wade through the waves to the west of the walls, to avoid going through the entrance. Another group set up a position on the small island to the east, and began to plan their attack. The Collective focused their efforts on the western group first, launching arrows at the group before they had a chance to plan out their attack. As the attackers charged the Collective, Blackthorn attempted to use her new powers to summon a tangle of thorns to block their path, but her magic still had its limits, and wasn't able to force thorns to grow in the loose sand. Thankfully the elves were no slouches, and the Order's heavy armour worked against them, slowing them and allowing the elves to launch numerous arrows at each of them, taking them down before they ever got close. Pivoting to the eastern group, they were finally able to use their defences for some extra cover. Apple and Elven moved to intercept one of the attackers who had waded past the defences, whilst Magnala used her body as a wall to protect the archers, so that they could continue to fire upon the attackers. The archers' mastery of their weapons made light work of the enemies, bringing them low without great difficulty. Magnala and Apple had taken a few hits, but they'd done their jobs to perfection, and at least this time they had a hospital to recover in, which was especially important as one of Magnala's wounds became infected. But with medicine, a hospital bed to rest in, and the treatment of Dr. Gunther, the group were confident that she would make a full recovery. Although the smithy building was almost done, Jayla hadn't quite figured out the specifics of constructing a forge yet. The building could still be used in the meantime though, and in the interest of keeping all of their roasty toasty burny hot processes in one building, they decided it'd be the perfect place to put a kiln. Using the kiln, they could fire the clay they were digging up from the ponds, and form it into proper bricks that could be used for construction. It seemed as though the universe itself was excited to test out the new hospital, as Prentice, Oilwoon and Apple all came down with the plague. Things were going quite smoothly at the moment though, so it wouldn't be the end of the world to have them each take a few rest days while they battled their illness. With the group being consistently unable to reach their own defences before attackers did, Louisa suggested that it was about time they rethought their current system. He didn't have a full plan yet, but suggested starting by digging out a few trenches to the west, to slow the approach of attackers, since the last group had simply walked up and around the outside of the wall. With Prentice being heavily pregnant and afflicted with the plague, Gunther was very concerned for her. As he prayed for her that night, he felt as though he came to understand his magics a little better. Utilising his new ability, he was able to use his magic to reinforce Prentice's body's ability to fight off the plague. As a result of this, along with the generally good quality of treatment they'd been receiving in the hospital, it seemed that all of the plague-ridden members of the collective were on track to make a full recovery. The next morning, the group got some unexpected guests, in the form of dwarves from the southern dwarven city-states. Dwarves didn't often venture far from their lands, so it was odd to see a couple of them this far from home. With the first potato harvest coming in, the group were feeling a lot better about the ever-impending winter. It was a massive haul, and would help see them through a lot of the winter months. They were far from completely in the clear, but it was a wonderful start to their stockpile. The next day, Prentice finally went into labour, sending Louisa and Gunther into an anxious frenzy. Prentice had collapsed in the mushroom dome, so Gunther ran over to try and get her, so he could carry her to the hospital so they could deliver the baby. But seemingly the baby had no interest in waiting, and before either of them had even noticed it, the baby seemed to have slipped out of Prentice halfway across the fields. Gunther didn't even notice, and continued carrying Prentice to the hospital. Thankfully, the child's father Louisa heard its cries, and collected it from the muddy earth, taking it back to its new crib in their house. Despite the circumstances, both baby and mum were happy and healthy, and as such the collective welcomed their first brand new member, Sammy Crab. It may have been a bit preemptive, but Oilwoon was eager to test out their new handmade clay bricks, so she set about a small side project to throw together a classroom on the eastern edge of town, where little Sammy could take lessons. In 2 to 3 years, that is. She also took the opportunity to link up the pathways to the Mushroom Dome, for easier traversal to their little hot room. It seems that the old Empire were trying another tactic to deal with the collective. Instead of simply sending a war party to destroy them, they'd sent a royal tribute collector, hoping to convince the Phyrexian collective to pay tribute to the Emperor and thus be subsumed by the Empire. The collective, of course, had no such intentions. Had they the strength, they would have killed the tribute collector and his party for their audacity, but fearing that they weren't quite strong enough yet, they held off on initiating violence and instead simply refused to pay tribute. The next morning they were able to bring in a harvest of hay and flax, almost completely guaranteeing that they'd have enough food to keep their horses going over the winter. With a haul of mushrooms coming in too, the group actually soon realised they didn't have enough storage space for all of this food they'd managed to produce. It was certainly a wonderful problem to have. They decided to build an extra shelf in the food room to expand their storage options. One winter essential that the group were growing short on, however, was wood. They'd cleared out almost every tree inside the walls of the city, and although they'd planted a small crop to the east, these would take quite a while to be suitable for harvest. Blackthorn, however, felt that she had a solution. Her powers were growing by the day, and she decided to show off to the group by causing a small sprout of trees to erupt from the ground, almost fully grown and ready for harvesting. The effort clearly took a lot out of her, and was unlikely to be something she could do every day, but it would be very helpful to them in their efforts to keep themselves warm in the winter. The Divine Order didn't take their first defeat lightly, and soon returned with an even larger group, determined that brutal violence was the only way to deal with this new faction. The Collective were actually able to get to their defences before the attackers this time, and Oiwun and Apple took up positions in the gateway, looking to block the attackers, whilst the archers rained hell on them from behind the embrasures. In an effort to slow the attackers' advance, Blackthorn summoned a thicket of thorns again, but this time the ground worked with her. One of the attackers was also a magician, and threw up a shield to prevent the archers from firing upon them. Thankfully, despite magic being rare, the elves were familiar with some of its combat applications, and quickly repositioned themselves to be inside the shield, allowing them to continue firing upon the attackers who were also inside its perimeter. In the chaos of the melee, Oiwun took one hit too many, and hit the ground. Apple tried valiantly to hold the ground herself, but was soon also overwhelmed. One of the Divine Order's mystics threw some sort of bomb filled with incendiary material, which exploded in the entrance, setting fire to the downed Apple. The group were now on a deadline to wrap up the fight and save Apple. Jayla and Louisa drew their swords and took on the role of defensive melee fighting, soon joined by a heavily injured Oiwun who dragged herself back to her feet. Thankfully, throughout all of this, the archers had been laying down a continual stream of arrows, and soon the attackers were all but gone, and those few that remained were forced to flee. It had been a rough fight, with Apple and Oiwun both down, and Jayla, Louisa and Magnala taking a fair beating in their efforts to enter the melee fight. Thankfully, the location of the hospital had finally worked out exactly as planned, and the group were able to get all of the injured into beds and treat them within minutes of the fight ending. In her efforts to prove her worth, Magnala ignored her injuries, however, to try and fight back the fire that was threatening to engulf their defences. Her bravery was commendable, but stupid, and she soon developed an infection in one of her injuries. Louisa also got one of his wounds infected, but with Guthor managing to save the defences from the flames, and no one dead, at least not yet, the group couldn't help but feel that they'd come away from that attack quite well, given the seriousness of the raid. That said, the stress of it all had been a bit much for Oiwun, who fell into a catatonic state. Although moods had been a little better recently, they still hadn't been amazing, so no one was too surprised by this outcome. That night, Prentice gave the group some pretty depressing news. It was already becoming too cold for their crops to grow. Even with the additional growth from ploughing the soil, the corn was still nowhere near finished. The reality was, there simply wasn't a long enough growing window in this part of the world to allow them to grow corn. With her research into smithing complete, Jayla worked with Magnala in Oiwun's absence to start planning out the forge and the smithy. In the interest of not having a wooden floor inside the room full of roasty toasty burny hot things, Magnala also decided to use some of their clay to throw down a non-flammable floor in the smithy. Sadly, the catatonic Oiwun missed the celebrations for Jayla and Guthor's marriage, which happened the next day. Despite the horrors of how quickly winter had come back around, the group had a fun day celebrating together. Oiwun had unfortunately lost her leg during the previous attack. Guthor figured that while she was catatonic and not doing anything anyway, it would be the perfect opportunity to give her a peg leg. Of course, no sooner had he had this thought than Oiwun snapped out of her catatonia. Eager to give her the best mobility they could, however, Guthor agreed to operate anyway, even if it would mean her being under anaesthetic for the next few days. Thankfully, with Guthor's medical skills, the operation went off without a hitch. Oiwun certainly wouldn't be able to move as fast as before, but the peg leg would give her a fair bit more speed than no leg at all. Louisa had still been thinking about their defences, and thought he'd finally come up with a solution to help improve them. The first step would be to move their traps over to the western gate, and start to use that as their primary entrance and exit from the base. This entrance was already fully blocked by the trenches they'd dug, so any attackers approaching would be slowed significantly, increasing the chances that the group could reach the defences first. The next day, the snows arrived, with the temperatures outside already reaching a Baltic -16 degrees. With the snow arriving, continuing to eat their meals at the gazebo seemed like a poor idea, so the construction team began throwing some walls up around it, to try and keep it at a comfortable temperature so that the group could relax in there a little easier. The trees outside of the town's walls were the next to go, and with them the entire wood supply on the peninsula had been harvested by the collective. To make the wood they'd gathered go a little bit further, the group decided to burn some of it into charcoal. The charcoal could be used in the forge to smelt iron, which the wood couldn't. Things progressed slowly the next few days. After a few days of gathering together their resources, Louisa began explaining his new plans for the defences. As the group were struggling to reach the defensive line before the attackers, he wanted them to move the defensive line further north, closer to the centre of the town. As the hospital, smithy and animal pen were all in the way of this at the centre of the peninsula, he instead suggested making the empty western section of the peninsula the new entrance. This way, the defensive line would be closer to where the members of the collective could typically be found, whilst also forcing the attackers to walk further before they reached the defences. To further encourage attackers to take this path, he also suggested expanding the eastern wall further out into the sea, hopefully far enough that it wasn't worth the effort for attackers to take that route. Much to Lisa's chagrin, the new defences weren't even close to finished when the Divine Order decided to take another swing at the collective. As the collective's forces trickled over, the archers began taking up positions of cover near the smithy and a large meteor of coral that had fallen nearby. Apple worked to distract one of the knights, whilst the archers peppered him with arrows. She then began advancing, along with a mounted Oiwun, on one of the humans who'd made their way into the smithy. Despite the Divine Order's armour and technology, in the form of boomsticks, the elves were becoming lethal with their bows after all of this practice, and were able to outmatch the technologically advanced Order easily. The Order had also split their attacking force, but as the second, smaller group approached, the collective weren't feeling too much concern. They were happy that they were managing to defend themselves so well, but they couldn't help but fear that the more of the Divine Order they killed, the heavier the next blow would be. As they examined the outcome, they realised that one of the attackers had actually managed to break down the gate in the centre of the wall. Improving the defences would need to be the immediate focus. Thankfully, Oiwun was still a paragon of hard work, and soon had the first section of the new defensive wall completed. It was important that the hospital was still able to be quickly reached from the new defensive line, so the group hollowed out more of the hill to allow for another entrance to the hospital on the western side, closer to the new defences. They also chose to replace the wooden walls with clay instead. The last thing they need is a bunch of injured people being caught up in an inferno. Unfortunately, the pressure of all the construction tasks were getting too much for Oiwun. In a fit of rage, Oiwun decided to take out her frustrations on the collective's animals. Guthar tried to apprehend her before she could do it, but he was too far away, and Oiwun unfortunately murdered their stallion. This sadly left the group with only female horses, putting an end to their horse breeding program. Having regained her composure and being filled with regret, Oiwun buried herself deeper in her work to try to atone for her crime, making sure to finish up the forge so that the group could finally use the smithy to its full potential. As the group were finishing up the alterations to the hospital, an exotic goods trader from the guild arrived, and, much to the group's joy, they were able to purchase a new stallion from the traders. It cost them one of their mares and some old stone tablets that the Divine Order had dropped, but they'd be able to keep their little horse herd going. Content that her research work had already taken the group quite far, Jayla took a break from it to fire up the forge for the first time and start producing the group's first batch of iron. Although having little Sammy join the team had been nice and would eventually be helpful, Guthor wanted to expand their population much faster, and the best way to do that would be to convince other members of the old races to join them. To this end, he had the group begin mining out a small prison in the hillside near the new defences. His thinking was, if they got attacked by an old world faction, any survivors could be quickly dragged to the prison to be tended, and, over time, convinced to join them. As part of the new defence initiative, the group also wanted to replace all of the wooden palisades with proper walls, to prevent them from being susceptible to fire. Not wishing to dismantle the palisades though, just in case they got attacked in the meantime, they planned to build additional walls behind the palisades, which, once completed, would be the new city walls. To build these new walls, they would utilise the bricks they'd been producing from clay, and for the new gates, they would use some of the iron they'd begun to produce. The group soon found that they had a new terror to deal with, something known in these lands as the Pale Scourge. It occurred when something, perhaps an earthquake or some other incident, interfered with the trolls who lived in the twisting caverns beneath the land. Following this event, the trolls would make their way to the surface in packs, usually wreaking havoc on anything near them. The howls echoing through the night were unmistakable to those who'd borne witness to such events before. The collective knew they'd have to steel themselves for a potential flood of trolls heading their way. Sure enough, the very next day, a pack of 5 trolls entered the peninsula, immediately taking down some of the local wildlife and tearing them apart. A single troll even managed to take down a Utaranus on its own. Eager to deal with the trolls before they could find their way into the town, or worse yet, before even more showed up, the archers all ventured out of the town to try and take down the trolls. The key to achieving this would be to try and take them one at a time. If all 5 charged them, there would be little they could do, and they'd just have to hope they could get back to the defences in time. Thankfully, despite the hardiness of the trolls, the archer contingent were becoming master marksmen, and together they managed to target the troll's limbs to slow it down and leave it exposed. Once it was down, they moved forward to engage the next one, whilst Orlun brought up the rear to put the downed beast out of its misery. The final 2 trolls charged the group together, but after having taken out 3 already, the archers were confident and held their ground, managing to take down the final troll as it was just meters from reaching them. Continuing with the defence update, the group removed the spikes from the front of the main section of the palisades and replaced those with the new wall, keeping the palisade intact for now until the new wall could be completed. Before they could do much else, 2 drogs, massive boar-like creatures, charged into the town. Despite the skill of the archers, the drogs were incredibly hardy and took a great many arrows to injure. The group all scattered to draw their attention in multiple directions, all while laying into them with a flurry of arrows. Guthor was unfortunately the slowest of the bunch, and after being gored by the drogs' razor-sharp tusks, he hit the ground, bleeding profusely. At that point, the drogs then split their attention, with one hunting down Blackthorn whilst the other went after Magnala. Blackthorn led hers over to Lisa and Jayla, whilst Magnala led hers towards Prentice. Unfortunately, Blackthorn's drog caught up to her fast and started laying into her. But Lisa and Jayla were still firing at the beast, weakening it with every arrow. Magnala and Prentice were both on the run at this point, and decided to hop over the fence into the animal pen, hoping that the pen might slow their drog down and allow them to get a few shots off. But it seems as though the small fence was little issue for the massive creature. Lisa, Jayla and Blackthorn all managed to make it to the front gate, and having removed the spikes from the outside of the palisade, they were able to take up positions at the embrasures and fire back into the town to hit the drog. Despite their hardiness, the drog following Magnala and Prentice had taken a lot of hits, and had slowed enough to allow them to escape through the walls and begin firing upon it from the other side, allowing them to take it down. Just as they were working to take down the second drog, another swarm of trolls entered the peninsula, proving the Pale Scourge to be in full effect. Thankfully, by this point, the second drog had lost enough blood that it also went down. Oywoon dragged the heavily injured Gunther into the hospital, and Apple began emergency treatment. It was close. Dangerously, worryingly close. But she managed to stabilise him in the end, although he'd likely remain in the hospital for quite some time. Blackthorn had taken a bit of damage too, but her thick, sap-like blood meant that she'd lost a lot less than Gunther, so would likely be back on her feet sooner. Of course, the trolls weren't going to wait before they became an issue, with one charging at Oywoon as she tried to work. With a sigh of frustration, Louisa gathered up Prentice, Jayla and Maganala and led them to the palisades so they could start taking down the trolls. Blessedly, despite their higher numbers, the trolls weren't nearly as difficult to take down as the drogs had been. The danger of the drogs hadn't quite ended, however, as one of Blackthorn's wounds got infected. Apple did her best to tend to her, but her medical skills just weren't comparable to Gunther's. Sadly, Gunther was still unable to move. Apple tried her best, but the infection was looking dicey. Awakening the next evening, still weakened but eager to get moving, Gunther noticed the sick Blackthorn next to him in the hospital, and, ever eager to protect his people, channeled some of his new magic into bolstering her body's immune system, helping it fight back against the infection. He hadn't expected it to be quite as effective as it was, and was quite taken aback by how quickly Blackthorn seemed to improve. To accompany this success, the next morning saw the ground finally thawing, and the first of the year's crops being planted once more. They'd changed up the crops a little this time around, planting carrots instead of the radishes and berries, and replacing the cornfield with a field of peas instead. The pea field was quite large, so if they were able to get a haul in from it before the next winter, they should be in a good position. Gunther was feeling a little down that they hadn't been able to increase their numbers that much lately. Too many of their recent attacks had come from human factions, which offered no chance for them to recruit new people. In an attempt to remedy this, he suggested that himself and a couple of the others head out to a nearby hunting camp that they'd heard about from a guild merchant. The merchant had suggested that there was elves camped out here. It was just a tiny, temporary little camp, but if there were indeed elves there, Gunther wanted to see if he could convince them to join the collective. Arriving at the camp, the elves soon engaged the collective in combat, which hadn't been unexpected given the Elven city's thoughts on the collective and their mission. Given that the defenders were also elves, and hunters at that, a fair few arrows flew in both directions, with a good amount of them finding their marks. But in the end, the more battle-tested collective came out on top. Sadly, their aim had been a little too good, and only one of the hunters remained alive. But one was better than none. Patching her up, they soon packed up their things and made the short walk back to Ysera's perch, dragging their new prisoner with them, and incarcerating her in their brand new prison cell in the hillside. Now that they were a little bit more secure in Ysera's perch, it was time to start thinking even bigger. Hey guys, Tuna here, thank you for watching through to the end of this one. Ended up being a bit of a chonky one, but I am hoping that we're now in a position to enact the next step of the Phyrexian Collective's plans. You'll just need to stay tuned to find out though. Do subscribe to be notified when the next episode drops, and until next time, I hope that life treats you well. Bye bye!